If I had a nickel for every oversized 1980s cyberpunk manga I own at this moment in time, beginning with the letter A, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. I was having a conversation with the main man recently, and I got to realizing that, despite the general consensus of the community, older manga were just kind of built different. And this goes for a range of decades, whether you want to go back to the 1960s and the founding era of manga with stuff like Dororo and Barefoot Gen, or even just right before the turn of a decade. The general audience for anime will put different stuff in the mainstream. And if you look hard enough, you can still find your Akiras and Alitas all over the place in the modern industry. But the unfortunate reality is that to make these series acceptable to the modern audience, they need to be heavily toned down, or so disgustingly morphed you can't really tell what's what anymore. A good example of that being the 2019 Alita live-action film, which for a live-action anime adaptation from the West, was actually extremely faithful. The main gripe coming from not only the censorship, but also the new context the story is displayed in, turning a poignant and shocking story about human rebirth, and the value of humanity into an everyday superhero movie. It's not as bad as another No.
Ah, look at the top of his head!
For all intents and purposes, it's pretty soulless. My brother saw the film in a hospital bed in 2022, and he really didn't think much of it. Quite the opposite, he actually hated Alita on his first viewing of it. He was looking for some research material in his library about a week ago. Found that his library actually had all 5 volumes of the Alita manga. So he picked up one and told me he was going to start reading it to see if I'd been egging him on about the quality of the manga compared to the movie. And bearing in mind, this is coming from a guy who took 3 years to watch all of JoJo's. And he still has not finished it. Managed to read the entire first volume in less than a day. That's a pretty common Alita W, though. Yukito Kishiro's design and world building is so uniquely accessible, not because it's generic or inoffensive, but because the manga hits this really nice sweet spot between soft animation and hardcore detailed grunge. This manga really can appeal to anyone, while still maintaining a distinct personality and bold presentation. Looking to media in the 1970s and 80s, whether here in the West or overseas, there was a definite testosterone overhaul. Some of the most iconic anime of the 80s were City Hunter, Dragon Ball, JoJo, Berserk, as well as Fist of the North Star and Kinnikuman. And that's without going into the 1980s muscle boom here in the West. So staging the main character of Alita as a more fragile feminine character works really well for it. It also doesn't hurt that Alita herself as a character is so distinctly likable. Tropes like amnesia or personality disorder can often lead to a character feeling bland and empty simply because the character themselves doesn't even know what they're supposed to be, let alone the writer sometimes. But I think Alita managed this really well by giving her from day one optimistic, outgoing vibe she had. A lot of characters in Alita, both from a design and personality standpoint, are very rough and inhuman looking, especially like Mukaku, the first antagonist of the series, who introduces himself by practically announcing that
I beat women. I do it for sport.
And that, along with her size difference and the difference in power in those early chapters, is what makes a lot of Alita's early character decisions so impactful. Alita, from early on, is established to have a prerequisite knowledge of a fictional martial arts designed for cyborgs. And so a lot of her fighting style in the manga is dedicated to dodging and strafing. It's basically the Dark Souls of manga for real. When people talk about fight paneling in manga, they always go straight to Dragon Ball, and that's for good reason, but I actually think I like Alita's execution of what Toriyama was trying to do in Dragon Ball, simply because the choreography is a lot more dynamic, and the character matchups in the fights are a lot more aesthetically variable thanks to the cybernetic implants that people overdose themselves on in Alita. The antagonists in Alita are honestly really underrated. While the first one, Mukaku, isn't really anything special from a character writing standpoint, in terms of design and how he's utilized as a day one villain, I think he did a really good job. But the series really starts to hit its trend with the villain of the second volume, Jashugan. Zaban's character design is sick as hell, and the way they use him in volume 3 is just, it's really sick. And Desti Nova not only is the main and final antagonist of the series, but also a core piece of Alita's development, is really well executed. My only gripe with Alita is the fact that this manga actually has two different endings. The original ending and the ending that leads into Battle Angel Alita Last Order. I haven't read Last Order, so maybe that ending would feel better to me in retrospect, but I actually prefer the flower ending of Alita. No spoilers. The main character has amazing development, it has amazing villains, the art is peak. The side characters, for once, go just as hard as the main character. And to top it off, it's just completely insane. There's little to no reason for you to not read Alita. Now!